The wooden shutters didn't just slam. They cracked against the wall like a gunshot. Reverend Elias Moore filled the doorway, a mountain of black cloth and fury. His boots hit the floorboards, 1-2, 1-2, the sound of a hangman walking to the gallows. In the corner, by the cold hearth, Abigail trembled. She wasn't alone. In her arms, she clutched a tiny bundle, a newborn son, his skin still angry and red from birth. He was wrapped in her old linen shawl, the only thing that felt soft in a world gone sharp. "You shame me," Elias spat, and the words were like acid. "You shame this house, you shame this town, you shame my church." His eyes fell on the bundle. "And you dare bring that bastard into my sight?" "Father." Abigail's voice was a ragged whisper, lost in the cavernous room. "Please, he's my son. He's just a baby." "He is sin made flesh." Elias's voice was a blade, cold and sharp. "You think your weeping excuses fornication? You think your tears wipe clean your whoredom?" Her body shook with a sob she couldn't hold back. "I was forced!" she cried, the words she'd been screaming in her heart for months. "You know it. Sheriff Wilkins. He came when no one else was home. I begged him." Elias barked a laugh, a sound with no humor in it, only jagged edges. "You begged?" he mocked. "A righteous woman would have fought. A righteous woman would have screamed loud enough to rattle the very walls of heaven." Across the room, her mother, Ruth, was a ghost pressed against the wall. Her hands were clenched so tight her knuckles were white. Her lips were pale, bloodless. She hadn't said a word. Elias had forbidden it. He had forbidden his own wife from comforting their daughter. Abigail crumpled to her knees, the floorboards hard and unforgiving. The baby whimpered, a tiny fragile sound against the storm of his grandfather's rage. She held him tighter. "Please," she begged again. "Just let him be baptized. Let him have a name." "He has no name because he has no father." Elias leaned down, his face a mask of disgust, his breath a winter wind. "He is a stain, and you are the cloth he has stained." He stood up straight, his shadow swallowing her. "You will leave this house at dawn. Take the child. Take your shame, but you will not take our name." The days that followed were a quiet kind of violence. No one spoke to her, but their silence screamed. Stones, small at first, would thud against the shutters of her little sewing shop at night. Children, who once brought her dolls to mend, now chanted in the streets. "Unclean! Unclean!" they sang, their parents watching from behind curtains. Her food rations from the town store were cut. Neighbors she'd known her whole life turned their backs, crossing the street to avoid her shadow. One night, a bottle shattered her window. Tied to its neck was a scrap of paper, torn from the Bible. In her father's elegant, cruel script, it read, "Suffer not a witch to live." Fear, cold and sharp, coiled in her stomach. This wasn't just shunning. This was a death sentence. 3 nights later, she woke to the smell of smoke. Flames, orange and greedy, were eating the walls of her shop. She grabbed the baby and ran, barefoot, into the street, watching the only life she'd ever built turn to ash. No one came to help. They just watched. She saw their faces in the firelight, a jury of silent accusers. At dawn, she stood at the threshold of the house she grew up in. The baby was bundled tight in her arms. Her face was pale, smeared with soot, but her eyes were dry. She had no tears left. The front door closed behind her. The click of the latch was the sound of a life ending. Her father had taken everything. Her books, her clothes, her mother's locket. All she had was the shawl on her son, a tin water cup, and the crushing weight of a world that never forgave women for surviving. She took 2 steps, the dust of the road already clinging to her bare feet. Then, a creak. "Abby." The whisper was so faint she thought she'd imagined it. Her mother, Ruth, ran from the house, her face a mess of terror and love. She clutched a small wicker basket. "There's bread," she said, her voice shaking, pressing the basket into Abigail's hands. "And lard, and a tin of healing salve. It's not much, but—" "Mother, you can't," Abigail whispered, her heart breaking all over again. He said if I did." Ruth's eyes darted back to the house, wide with fear. It was too late. A roar erupted from the porch. "Ruth!" Elias stood there, his face purple with rage. "What are you doing?" Ruth stepped in front of Abigail, a frail shield. "I was only—" The basket was ripped from her hands. Elias didn't just drop it, he flung it to the ground. Bread and lard scattered in the dirt. The tin of salve rolled into a puddle. Then he moved faster than Abigail had ever seen him move. He struck his wife across the face with the back of his hand. The sound was like a whip crack. Ruth fell hard, her lips splitting open, blood welling instantly. He grabbed her by the hair, dragging her back toward the unforgiving door. "Take your filth and go!" he screamed at Abigail, his eyes burning with a righteous fire that felt more like hell. "And know this, you are no daughter of mine." Abigail stood frozen, the world tilting. Her baby cried softly against her breast. She stared at the smashed bread in the dirt, at the precious salve now lost. She saw her mother's eyes, full of pain, pleading with her to just run. Ruth was pulled back inside. The door slammed shut. And then another sound filled the morning air, sharp and rhythmic, the snap of a leather belt. Again and again. Abigail didn't scream. She didn't cry. All the feeling in her had turned to ice. She adjusted her son in her arms, turning her back on the house. She walked past the basket, past the porch, past the 18 years of her life that had just been erased. She walked until the sound of the belt was lost to the wind. She walked until the house was just a dark shape against the rising sun. She whispered to the sleeping child in her arms, a solemn vow. "You will never know this place, and I will never let it know you." And then she kept walking, her feet unsteady, but forward. Always forward. She had been cast out, but she still carried a name no one could take from her. Mother. The woods at night were a different kind of cruel. The trees had teeth, their branches gnarled and sharp, tearing at her threadbare dress. The infant was a heavy weight, a precious stone she couldn't afford to drop. Her arms ached with a fire that spread to her back, her legs, her very soul. Leaves crackled under her bare feet, every step an announcement in the suffocating silence. Then a wolf howled, a long mournful cry that slid down her spine like ice water. Another answered, closer this time. She flinched and spun, her eyes wide, trying to see into the crushing darkness. The baby whimpered, sensing her terror. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a wild drum in the night. She needed water, food, shelter. She needed a miracle. She'd followed no path, just a desperate instinct to stay hidden, to melt into the shadows, away from roads and men. But the forest was a living thing, and it was hungry. Its shadows writhed and danced, taking on shapes she didn't want to see. Her foot caught on a root, hidden beneath the dead leaves. She pitched forward, a strangled cry escaping her lips. She twisted her body, landing on her knees, cradling the baby, protecting him with every ounce of strength she had left. He cried out, a sharp, sudden wail of shock and fear. "Shh, shh." Abigail rocked him, her voice trembling. "It's all right. It's all right." But it wasn't. Nothing was all right. Her lips were cracked, her throat was a desert. Her breath came in ragged, painful gasps. She saw a thick-limbed pine, its lowest branches just out of reach. Maybe if she could climb, she could rest. Just until morning. Get away from the things that hunted on the ground. She hoisted herself up, one hand gripping the rough bark, the other clutching her son. She tried to use her knees, to find a foothold, to push herself just a little higher. The bark slipped. Her fingers, slick with sweat and fear, lost their grip. The world flipped upside down. The baby screamed. Her back struck the hard earth, knocking the wind out of her. Her head cracked against a stone she hadn't seen. Stars exploded behind her eyes. The night swirled, the trees melting into a blur. Her vision narrowed to a tiny pinprick of light. Pain, white-hot and searing, ripped through her skull. The baby was still crying, but the sound was getting farther away. Was she losing him? Was she losing herself? The blackness rushed in, a final cold wave. And then, light. Not the holy light of heaven, not the bright light of dawn. It was a flicker of orange. A campfire. Through her slitted eyes, she saw a figure. He stood a few yards away, a silhouette against the flames, cloaked in shadow and smoke. A man. Tall. Still. A long knife was strapped to his side, a bow slung over his shoulder. His hair was long and raven black, and his eyes, reflecting the fire, looked like an animal's. He called himself Taza. He'd been hunting alone, tracking an old elk for 2 days, when he heard it. A baby's cry, shrill and wrong, a sound that didn't belong in the whisper of the wind through the pines. His first thought was that it was a trick. White men had used such tactics before, luring a warrior in with a sound of distress, only to spring a trap. But curiosity was a stronger pull than fear. He moved like a ghost through the trees, his feet making no sound on the forest floor. He approached the grove where the cries came from, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. What he found stopped him cold. A woman, pale-skinned and broken, lay at the base of a great pine. Blood was crusted on her temple, a dark flower in her blonde hair. Her body was curled protectively around a child, an infant barely days old, swaddled in what looked like rags. They looked like fallen leaves, discarded and forgotten. He crouched, every muscle tense. He waited, scanning the shadows. He listened. Nothing moved but the gentle rise and fall of the infant's tiny chest. This was no trap. But it made no sense. Why was she here? Why was she alone? Taza studied the woman. Her arms were covered in dark bruises. One of her feet was scraped raw and bleeding. The baby's cheek was a blotchy red from the biting cold. Yet, even unconscious, her grip on the child was unbreakable. Taza's jaw tightened. He could walk away. He should walk away. It was not his fight. No one would ever know he was here. The white people, the Nahuac, they called his kind thieves, savages, shadows in the woods. If he took her back to his camp, they would say he stole her. If he left her, the wolves would find her before morning. But the child's cry, softer now, a desperate, hungry whimper, pierced something deep inside him. Something he thought had died long ago. He made his decision. With slow, careful movements, he slid his pack from his shoulders. He pulled out his cloak, a heavy thing of bison hide, stitched with years of wear, and the memory of the first beast he had ever felled. He wrapped it around them both, mother and child, a cocoon of warmth against the cold night. "Easy now," he muttered, not to them, but to the spirits of the forest, to the night itself. He checked her legs. One ankle was twisted, swollen and purple. The skin was raw from walking too far, too long. Her hair was stuck to her neck with sweat and grime. He slid his knife from its sheath. The blade gleamed in the firelight. He cut a piece of leather from his own wrist binding. Gently, so gently, he used it to tie a splint made of bark to her injured ankle. Then he picked her up. She was lighter than he expected, like a bird with a broken wing. She moaned softly but didn't wake. The baby stirred, but didn't cry. Taza adjusted his grip, tucking the small bundle closer to his chest, feeling the faint warmth of the child's body against his own. He whistled once, a low, soft note. His horse, a dappled gray, emerged from the trees, silent and waiting. He lifted her into the saddle, careful not to jostle the child. But before he mounted, he knelt by a patch of bare earth. From his satchel, he pulled a small forked twig, smoothed by his own hands. He tied a single black feather to it with a strip of sinew. He planted it upright in the soil, whispering in the tongue of his people. It was a sign for the Earth Mother. A prayer. I bring life not of my blood. I ask your permission to shelter them. Only then did he mount the horse, settling behind her, his arms a protective cage around her and the child. He turned toward the hidden path that led to his shelter, a place deep in the folds of stone, where the wind did not bite and the night could not reach. He did not know her name, he did not know her story, but he would not let her die. Not tonight. Abigail woke to the sound of whispering, not voices. It was the hush of pine needles rustling in a gentle breeze, the scent of wood smoke, the soft crackle of a dying fire. Her eyelids fluttered open. The world was dim, soft, unfamiliar. She was lying on a pallet of animal hides. Above her, a roof of bound branches and stretched rawhide. The walls of the shelter curved around her, like the inside of a hollowed-out nest. It was warm. Safe. Her heart gave a violent jerk. Where was she? Where was her son? Then she felt it. A soft breath, close by. She turned her head slowly. And there he was. Her son. Curled beneath a stitched buffalo hide, his tiny cheeks flushed from sleep. He stirred, yawned, and nestled deeper into the warmth. He was safe. The memories slammed back. A door kicked open in her mind. The dark woods, the fall, the searing pain, firelight, a shadowy figure, and then nothing. She sat up too fast. Pain, sharp and electric, lanced through her ankle. She looked down and saw it was bandaged, braced with a splint of bark. She winced, a gasp of pain escaping her lips. Suddenly the shelter's entrance darkened. A figure stepped inside, blocking the light. Abigail's breath caught in her throat. It was him. The man from the forest. The man whose eyes had burned in the firelight. He was taller in the dim light of the shelter, broader in the shoulder. He moved with a quiet gravity, a stillness that was more intimidating than any threat. His black hair was braided, woven with small red beads. A bone-handled knife hung at his side. But he made no move toward it. He knelt without a word and placed a wooden bowl of fresh water near her. Then, with the same deliberate care, he set down a bundle of fresh berries, a strip of dried meat, and something wrapped in leaves that smelled of mint and earth. Medicine. She stared, stunned. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice hoarse. He said nothing. He didn't even nod. He just looked at her. His eyes were dark, unreadable. But she saw no hunger in them, no malice. It was something else. Stillness. Recognition, maybe. Like looking into a mirror, not at a knife. Then he stood, turned, and ducked back out of the shelter, disappearing as silently as he had arrived. The moment he was gone, survival instinct took over. Abigail scrambled for a heavy stick lying near the fire pit, gripping it like a weapon. Her son whimpered. She hushed him, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She crawled to the entrance. Through the cracks in the hide wall, she saw him. He was tending the fire, his back to her, preparing what looked like a poultice over hot stones. He seemed completely unaware of her. She didn't wait. She didn't think. Gathering her son, she slipped out through a gap in the back of the shelter, stumbling into the cold morning air. The woods loomed, just as menacing as they had been in the dark. Fear, bitter and familiar, twisted her gut. She hobbled as fast as she could, her injured ankle screaming with every step. She pushed through the brush, branches tearing at her skin, her only thought to get away. Away from him. Away from this place. She made it maybe 100 yards. Then her good foot caught in a tangle of roots. She fell hard, once again using her body to shield the baby. The sound of cracking branches made her freeze. He was there, Not running, not angry. He just stood at the edge of the clearing, watching her. Waiting. Abigail pushed herself up, shaking with fear and exhaustion. She held the baby in one arm and brandished the stick with the other. "Don't touch us!" she hissed, the words raw and desperate. But he never moved. After a long, silent moment, he knelt down. He picked up the small pouch of berries she had dropped in her fall. He walked forward slowly and placed it gently on a rock beside her. Then he turned and walked away, back toward the shelter. His back was exposed, unthreatening. He was giving her a choice: run into the woods and die, or stay and live. That night, she didn't return to the shelter. She curled up at the tree line, too afraid to sleep, too exhausted to keep watch. The baby cried, a weak, hungry sound. She had no milk left. Her own body was failing. Her skin felt hot, her tongue thick and dry. A fever was taking hold. Near midnight, desperate for water, she stumbled toward a stream she had glimpsed earlier. She needed to cool her head, to soothe the fire that was building behind her eyes. She was so focused on the sound of the water, she never saw the snake. It struck without a rattle, without a warning. Pain, sharp and immediate, bloomed in her calf. It burned like a hot coal pressed against her skin. She screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure agony. And then, he was there. Taza. He moved faster than she thought possible, a blur of motion in the moonlight. He dropped to her side, tore the cloth of her dress away from her leg, his eyes finding the 2 small puncture wounds instantly. He didn't hesitate. He pressed his mouth to the bite, sucking hard, drawing the poison into his own body. He spat a dark mixture of blood and venom into the grass. Again and again. His movements were swift, efficient, desperate. Then he grabbed a handful of the same herbs she'd seen earlier, crushing them between his palms and packing the green pulp into the wound. Abigail sobbed, half from the searing pain, half from sheer, overwhelming disbelief. This man, this stranger she had tried to run from, was saving her life. He lifted her in his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her back to the shelter, back to the warmth. She was barely conscious, the world fading in and out of focus. He placed her down gently on the pallet of furs, covering her with the bison cloak. Then he did something that shattered the last of her fear. He took her crying child. He held the baby close against his own chest, rocking him gently, warming him with his own body heat as the mother shivered and burned with fever. Taza sat by the fire for the rest of the night. He did not sleep. He did not speak. He just watched the flames, one hand resting protectively on the child, the other periodically brushing the sweat from Abigail's brow with a cool, damp cloth. In the pale, early light of dawn, Abigail stirred. Her vision cleared. And there he was, kneeling beside her. His eyes were heavy with fatigue, but they were steady, unblinking. Her gaze met his, and for the first time, she did not look away. The days stretched into a week, then 2. Time blurred into a quiet rhythm of pine needles and wood smoke. They spoke no common tongue, but they found a language anyway. It started with their hands. One afternoon, while the baby napped on a sun-warmed stone, Abigail pointed to herself. "Abigail!" She mouthed the name, clear and slow. Then she gestured to the baby, placing a hand over her own heart. "Samuel?" Taza watched, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he picked up a piece of river stone and began to scratch on a flat slate near the fire. He drew a symbol. A circle, with arrows pointing inward, protecting a smaller, broken circle within. He placed his hand over the drawing, his fingers splayed like roots. Family, Abigail understood. His was broken too. He wiped the slate clean with the heel of his hand and drew again. Figures with feathers and bows. Then other figures, with rifles and blue coats. A violent slash between them. Soldiers. Death. The past. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw a grief so profound it stole her breath. He tapped his own chest then, and drew one last shape. A single leaf, caught in the wind. Alone. Abigail reached for the slate to draw her own story of loss, but stopped. Instead, she pulled a scrap of worn cloth and a needle from the small bundle she'd managed to save. She began to stitch the hem of his cloak, where it had frayed from years of wear. Her fingers moved with a practiced grace, small, neat stitches that pulled the worn fabric back together. He watched her hands as if they were speaking a language he understood perfectly. That night, he returned with a bounty of roots and bark. He placed them carefully near the fire. Abigail ground them between two stones, boiled them in a battered pot she found, and added a pinch of wild garlic. It wasn't much of a stew, but it was warm, and it was food. They ate in silence, the crackle of the fire speaking for them. But a new shadow was falling over their fragile peace. That evening, Abigail sat beside the fire, her son nestled in her arms. The boy's cheeks were flushed a dangerous red. His breath was shallow and fast. His small body burned with a fever that terrified her. Her hands trembled as she dipped a cloth in cool water, laying it on his forehead. It did nothing. He only grew hotter. Her eyes filled with tears of helpless fear. Taza watched her, his face a grim mask. Then, without a word, he stood. He moved with a sudden, decisive purpose. He saddled his horse with calm, practiced movements. He slung a leather pouch across his back. He turned to her. He touched two fingers to his own lips, then gently to the child's burning forehead. It was a silent promise. Then he swung onto his horse and rode into the darkening woods, disappearing between the trees like smoke. Abigail waited. Hours crawled by. The sun fell, leaving her alone with the fire and her fear. The baby whimpered in her arms, a thin, weak sound that tore at her heart. She whispered lullabies, her voice breaking. The wind howled through the trees, mocking her. She watched the fire die down to glowing embers. She did not sleep. She couldn't. Just as the sky began to turn from black to gray, she heard it. Hoofbeats. Taza returned. His face was drawn, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. Mud streaked his boots and leggings. His hands, when he dismounted, clutched a bundle of herbs wrapped in fresh doe's skin. They were strange leaves, with a dark red vein running down the spine. He knelt and placed the bundle before her, a sacred offering. Steam rose as they boiled the leaves into a dark, bitter tea. Taza held the baby, his large, gentle hands supporting the child's floppy head, while Abigail carefully spooned the medicine into his mouth, drop by trembling drop. The child sputtered. He cried. He drank. And then, he was quiet. The fever broke at dusk. The heat receded from his skin, his breathing eased. He was sleeping, truly sleeping. Abigail collapsed beside the boy, burying her face in her hands, weeping with a relief so profound, it felt like pain. Taza stood watch all night, a silent guardian. The next day, as she was preparing fresh bandages for her own healing leg, she noticed a tear in the fabric of his shirt, near his shoulder. She reached for it instinctively, to mend it, then paused, her fingers hovering in the air. Taza didn't flinch. He didn't move at all. She gently slid the torn cloth from his shoulder. Underneath, a scar, long and jagged, slashed across his skin. It was like lightning frozen in flesh. It was old, healed over, but the skin was puckered and angry. A wound made by a blade meant to kill. She touched it, her fingertips tracing the violent line. "Who did this to you?" she whispered, the question escaping before she could stop it. He looked at her, his dark eyes holding a universe of pain. He didn't speak. He just looked up at the sky, at the trees, at the stones by the fire. He pointed to the wind, the sun, all of it. The world, she understood. The world had done this to him. Life. Men. Violence. a story stitched into his very skin. She didn't ask again. Instead, she pressed a clean bandage, one she had meant for herself, to his shoulder, covering the old wound as if to protect it from new hurts. Her touch was careful, firm. He did not look away. When she finished, she let her hand rest there for a moment, over the healed wound. And for a long time, they just sat, two souls with torn pasts, quietly sharing the same breath. That night, the fire burned steady and bright. Not just for warmth, but for belonging. The rains came with the subtlety of an ambush. It started as a low grumble across the plains, a ripple of unease in the gray sky. Abigail had just finished feeding the baby, who was gurgling happily in her lap, when the first cold drop struck her cheek. Taza looked up from the arrow he was fletching, his nostrils flaring as if he could smell the change in the air. He stood slowly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Sundowny," he murmured, a word she didn't know. Thunder's breath. Within moments, the sky tore open. Rain didn't fall, it attacked. It lashed through the forest, a solid wall of water that drenched everything in seconds. The simple canvas of their lodge sagged, heavy and leaking. Wind howled through the trees, a shrieking monster, pulling at the stakes, snapping branches like dry twigs. Abigail clutched the baby, who was now screaming with fright, wrapping them both in a wool blanket. Taza rushed inside, soaked and streaked with mud. One of the main support beams of the lodge had cracked under the strain. Without a word, he heaved the broken beam onto his shoulder, his back bending low, his muscles straining. He was using his own body to hold up the roof, shielding them as the storm raged. Lightning cracked directly overhead. The world flashed a brilliant, terrifying white. For a split second, she saw the lodge begin to give way. Taza let out a low shout, not of fear, but of command. "Down!" he ordered, and the one word was all she needed. Abigail ducked, curling her body into a tight ball around the baby. The next moments were a blur of chaos. Wind, rain, the groaning of wood. Taza's arms braced above them. Then, a sudden, deafening silence. Only the dripping of rain on wet earth remained. The shelter had collapsed around them, but they were safe. Taza had held. After the storm passed, leaving a world washed clean and broken, Taza led them to higher ground. He found a small glade, ringed by ancient, sturdy trees that had weathered 1,000 storms. And then he went to work. For days, he built. This time, not a temporary lodge of hide-and saplings. He built a home. He felled stripped cedar and pine with his axe. He shaped beams with his own hands, notching the joints with a flint blade, lashing them together with sinew and rope woven from bark. He covered the roof with layers of bark tiles and moss, thick and waterproof. Inside, he laid a circle of stones for a hearth. When it was done, Abigail stood at the threshold, the baby cradled in her arms. Sunlight streamed through the gaps between the logs, catching the golden fuzz of the baby's hair. She looked around at the solid beams, the deep fire pit, the racks for drying meat. "This is not just a shelter," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is a home." Taza didn't speak, but he met her eyes, and in their shared gaze was a language deeper than words. Gratitude, understanding, a shared breath in a place they had built together. That night, they sat by their new fire. Abigail had been using charcoal to practice writing on a flat stone. She showed it to him. She had written a single word: Hope. She pointed to the baby. "Her name is Hope." Taza repeated the word slowly, testing its shape in his mouth. His accent curled around it, made it something ancient and new at the same time. "Hope," he said again, a soft smile touching his lips for the first time. Then he took a piece of coal himself, and next to her careful letters, he drew the word. The lines were shaky, the O, a perfect circle, but it was there. He was learning her world, just as she was learning his. Abigail smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. In the days that followed, their lives intertwined. He taught her how to fletch an arrow, how to strip bark for a soothing tea, how to use flint and steel to conjure flame even in the dampest woods. She showed him how to shape letters, how to fold cloth into a clever cradle that could be slung on his back, how to laugh again, without fear. They didn't need many words. They had survival. They had fire. They had hope. The sound of hooves shattered the peace of the meadow like a stone through glass. Abigail straightened up from the patch of wild rye she'd been gathering, her brow damp with sweat, a bundle of stalks in her arms. Across the field, Taza paused. The blade he was using to clear brush held motionless in his hand. He looked toward the ridge. Dark figures. Riders. Abigail's heart seized. She clutched the baby closer. Hope was slung against her hip in a cloth wrap, dozing in the afternoon warmth. Taza's entire posture changed. He didn't move toward his bow, which leaned against a nearby tree. Instead, he reached for the child. Abigail handed Hope to him without a word, without a moment's hesitation. He stood between her and the approaching riders, a silent, unmovable shadow against the sun. They came fast. 6 of them. Their horses were lathered, their eyes sharp and hostile. At the front rode Deputy Thomas Crowley. His uniform was caked with dust, his badge dull, but his sneer was as sharp as ever. Behind him were men from the town, men she recognized, men who had stood by and watched her shop burn, who had never lifted a hand to help. "Well, I'll be damned," Crowley said, pulling his horse to a halt so sharp it kicked up a cloud of dust. "Look what the savage dragged in." One of the men behind him spat on the ground. Another cocked his rifle, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet meadow. "Miss Moore," Crowley called, his voice dripping with false concern. "We've come to rescue you. Did this wild dog take you against your will? Or were you always planning to shack up with a redskin?" Taza said nothing. He held Hope close, one powerful arm a shield across the tiny bundle. Abigail stepped out from behind him. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her voice was steady. "I am not going anywhere." "Lady," one of the riders said, dismounting. He was a blacksmith she'd known since she was a girl. "He's got you brainwashed. You don't know what you're saying. You're not safe here." Another man reached for her arm. "Come on now, Abigail. Let's not make a scene." His grip was firm, insistent. She jerked her arm free, stumbling back. "Let go of me!" she shouted. Taza stiffened, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he still did not reach for a weapon. Crowley slid from his saddle, moving closer, his hand hovering near the pistol on his belt. "What did he do to you, huh? Fill your head with savage nonsense? Did he hurt the baby? Tell us the truth, Abigail. We'll believe you." "No, you won't," she snapped, the words raw with the memory of all the times they hadn't believed her. "You never did." "Excuse me?" Crowley's face darkened. "I told the truth before," she cried, her voice rising, echoing across the valley. "I told the truth when I screamed in the dark and no one listened. Not my father, not the church, not the righteous men of this town." She stepped forward, her eyes blazing, pointing a trembling finger at the deputy. "If any of you still believe I am a victim, then let me choose my savior. And I choose this man. This warrior. This man who has never once made me feel small, or dirty, or afraid." A tense silence hung in the air, broken only by the wind whispering through the rye. Taza stood behind her, a silent mountain of support. Hope stirred in his arms, letting out a tiny cry. "You think he's a savage?" Abigail's voice trembled with a fury she didn't know she possessed. "He is the only one who stayed up all night when my daughter had a fever. He is the one who rode through a storm to find her medicine. He built us a home with his bare hands and has never asked for anything in return." No one spoke. Crowley's jaw was ticking, a muscle jumping in his cheek. Finally, the oldest of the riders, a farmer named Jed, leaned toward the deputy. "This ain't right, Tom. She ain't in chains. She ain't screaming for help. Let's just go." Crowley spat at the ground, his eyes full of venom. "You're making a mistake, girl." Abigail did not flinch. "Maybe," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "But it's mine to make." One by one, the riders turned their horses, their faces a mixture of confusion and disgust. Crowley lingered a moment longer. "Don't bother crawling back when he shows his true colors," he snarled. "You ain't got a place in our world anymore." "We'll make our own," Abigail said quietly. And with that, they rode off, the thunder of their hooves fading back the way they came. Taza let out a long, slow breath, his shoulders finally relaxing. He handed Hope back to her gently. Abigail pressed her cheek to her daughter's head, feeling the tremble in her own hands. Taza's palm rested lightly on her back, a silent, steadying presence. They stood in the quiet meadow, a family the world refused to accept. And yet, here they were, still standing. The valley Taza had found was a secret, cupped between two green hills. No roads reached it, only a winding deer path and the whisper of wind through tall grass. Here, the sun rose over a blanket of mist, and each morning brought the rustle of wild birds and the quiet echo of a life that didn't need anyone's permission to exist. Abigail stood beneath the overhang of their small home, Hope nursing peacefully in her arms. The house was nothing more than logs, clay, and thatch, but it was solid. It was safe. Behind it, a small garden was thriving. Beans curled up wooden stakes and squash leaves spread wide like protective hands. Nearby, a line of fish dried in the breeze, and a rabbit stew simmered over the coals. Taza moved with a quiet efficiency that still amazed her. He had dug irrigation ditches from the stream, built a smokehouse from river stones, and laid traps in the woods that were never empty for long. He carried Hope without hesitation, and every morning, he would place her cradle where the first rays of sun could warm her face. One day, he brought her a smooth stone he'd pulled from the river. He had etched into it a picture of a fire, and beside it, a crescent moon. When she asked him what it meant, his English, rough but getting better, formed the words. "Fire is how she survived," he said, pointing to Hope. "Moonlight is how I found you." They spoke more now. It was a strange mixture of his broken English and her clumsy attempts at his Comanche tongue, but between them bloomed a language of shared glances and gestures that was all their own. He taught her to dry herbs, to tan hides, to make arrowheads from flint. She showed him how to twist string from cattails and mend seams with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. Hope grew stronger each week, a happy, babbling child who giggled at the chickens and chased butterflies with clumsy, outstretched hands. But peace, she was learning, was never a permanent guest. It began with a scent. Faint at first, just a hint of roasted wood on the breeze, coming from the south. Taza stood at the edge of the hill, his head up, nostrils flaring. He muttered a word in his own language, a word that sounded like a curse. "Fire?" she asked, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. He nodded, his eyes grim. "South wind brings it." By nightfall, the smoke was a thick, hazy curtain that turned the setting sun a blood red. The trees whispered of danger in the way their leaves rustled. Taza packed a satchel with food, water, and their few precious medicines. He wrapped Hope against his chest in her sling. They moved the animals to a protected cove by the stream, covered the garden with soaked hides, and dug a shallow trench around their home. Still, the flames came. They appeared on the distant ridge like a line of orange ghosts, flickering, dancing, growing. When the fire hit the valley, it came with a roar like a freight train. Ash, hot and gray, fell like a toxic snow. The air grew thick and hard to breathe. Taza saw the neighbor's shed, a small homestead a mile down the valley, suddenly collapse under a shower of burning branches. And through the roar of the flames, he heard it. A child's scream. "No, Taza! There's no time!" Abigail gasped, grabbing his arm. But he was already running. He plunged into the smoke and chaos, his eyes burning. He found the child, a boy no older than 5, curled beside a stump, coughing and choking, too terrified to move. Taza grabbed him and bolted back, but a falling, fiery limb caught him across the shoulder, sending them both tumbling to the ground. With blood in his eyes and the boy clinging to his neck, Taza stumbled back through the choking darkness. Abigail hadn't stayed still. She had built a shield of wet blankets across the front of their house, dousing the walls with barrel after barrel of water. When Taza collapsed near the porch, she pulled the terrified boy away and somehow found the strength to drag Taza's heavy, unconscious frame into the cabin, slamming the door against the suffocating heat. The next few hours passed in a blur of heat and fear. Abigail soaked cloths, pressing cool water to Taza's burned skin. She kept Hope and the little boy tucked in the root cellar, their faces covered with damp rags. When the fire finally roared past, leaving a scorched, black landscape in its wake, their home, miraculously, still stood. Taza drifted in and out of consciousness for 2 days. On the 3rd morning, Abigail sat beside him, rewrapping the bandages on his shoulder with trembling fingers. "You almost died," she said, her voice raw. His eyes opened slowly. "But I did not." "You saved him," she whispered, looking over at the small boy, who now slept peacefully by the hearth. "You saved that little boy. He needed saving." She took his hand, calloused and worn, and held it against her heart. Her face was streaked with ash and tears. "I am not the preacher's daughter anymore," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "Not in God's house, not in the town's records, not on any piece of paper. But if you will have me, I am yours. Not by law, not by sermon, by soul." He did not speak. He only lifted her hand to his lips and kissed the small scar on her palm, where a splinter from the fire had dug deep. The gesture was quiet, but it was a vow. It was final. Hope babbled from her blanket, and the boy stirred nearby, rubbing his eyes. Abigail smiled through wet lashes. They were a strange family, forged not by tradition, but by fire and will. By nightfall, Taza was strong enough to stand. He limped with a branch as a cane, watching Abigail chase Hope across the singed but living earth. The boy, Eli, clung to her skirts. Later that night, Taza returned to the story stone by the river. Beneath the etching of the fire and the moon, he added another name. Eli, found in fire, kept by grace. No last names, only meaning, only belonging. Spring returned to the valley with soft rains and the hum of bees along the river banks. The scorched land pulsed with new life. Green shoots pushed through the blackened earth, buds appeared on the cottonwood trees, and the call of birds returning to old nests filled the air. And with the season, something deeper took root among the small family that had carved a home from exile. On a morning dusted with golden light, Abigail held her daughter close beneath a budding willow tree. "It is time," she said softly to Taza. "She needs a name that will hold both sun and shadow, both worlds." Taza stood beside her, his arms crossed, his gaze on the sky. "Hope," he said, as if it had always been her name and his. "Hope Taza." The name was spoken aloud just once, then carved gently into the old stone near the stream where her story, their story, had truly begun. Hope did not carry a surname from a single bloodline. She carried 2 worlds in her bones. The silence of the plains and the echo of church bells, now long forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Abigail transformed part of their home into something more. Beside the fields, under a canvas awning, she opened a small school. She taught the children of the few Comanche and Kiowa families who lived scattered through the hills. She taught them to read letters, to stitch cloth, to tell their own stories with needle and ink. Taza would often join her, etching symbols onto bark and bone, sharing the stories of his ancestors, of rivers and spirits and the great buffalo hunts. No child paid with coin. They paid with curiosity and were repaid with care. Hope sat among them, laughing, learning, her world made not of wooden pews and shame, but of rich earth and open acceptance. One evening, as the sun slid low behind the hills, the three of them, Taza, Abigail, and Little Hope, climbed the ridge overlooking the distant plains. Far beyond the trees, a faint smudge on the horizon, lay the town Abigail had once called home. A place that had judged her, scarred her, and cast her into the shadows. She felt no anger. She felt no longing. She felt nothing at all for that place. She placed a hand on Taza's shoulder. "I do not need to be welcomed by them," she said, her voice steady and sure. "I only need to be loved by you." A sound broke the stillness. A soft thwip, and then a vibration in the grass beside them. A single arrow had landed, its tip sunk lightly into the earth. Taza stepped forward, his body tense for a moment, before he knelt beside it. There was no danger in this, no warning. The shaft was marked with the feathers and beads of his own clan. It was a symbol of passage, a gift. He turned to Abigail, lifting the arrow for her to see. A slow smile spread across his face. "It means this land accepts us," he said. "My people have been watching. They accept our family." Hope clapped her small hands, thinking it was a game. The wind picked up, catching the small cloth flag they had raised over their home, a flag stitched with threads of deer sinew and dyed with wild berries. And for the first time in her life, Abigail felt the wind not as a force of judgment, but as a promise of belonging, a promise of family. If this story touched your heart, if you felt the wind of the prairie, the sting of injustice, and the quiet power of love that defies shame, time, and bloodlines, then this is just the beginning. At Wild West Love Stories, we bring you more than tales. We bring you truths wrapped in dust and devotion, where every heartbeat could be a goodbye or a forever. Subscribe now to never miss a new story. Saddle up. Ride with us through history. And remember, some love isn't written in law or scripture, but carved in courage, stitched in silence, and whispered on the wind. This is Wild West Love Stories, where the bullets missed, but the hearts didn't.